we're going to play a short little video to kind of get things off about an amazing company and some gentlemen who've flown all the way from the States to be here. But we'll role play the video and then we'll let the guys talk a bit about their business, and hopefully you'll get the agenda over the next few days of what we're trying to achieve here. It's a lovely place, we're at the Monaco Grand Prix, and we're trying to bring a little bit of intelligence and stuff for us to absorb as best as we can. So we've got some incredible people throughout the day, and Ali and team are going to lead the way and try and set the standards here. They're very impressive, God knows how many PhDs between them. So listen up everybody, but please if you could play the video and then we'll go from there.
It will take a few minutes to switch the sound.
all good. So I'm going to hand over to Ali and the team now to tell you a little bit more about, I guess, the future of innovation in life science and biotech. I think with the pandemic moving on now, we're all a bit self-conscious of other things in the air, and we're very interested into all types of prevention, R&D to kind of see what the future brings. But over to Ali, and again, thanks for everybody for listening.
It's going to be tough to visualize. Hello? Hello. That's loud. Well, thank you everyone for listening in today. It's an amazing opportunity to be here. It's very privileged. It's very nice weather, something we're not used to in Boston. So I definitely overdressed. But I'm enjoying the time here, and I'm hopeful to get in touch with all of you, speak a little bit more afterwards as well. It's working. So I have the unenviable task of educating and entertaining you with science this Friday morning. So if something doesn't make sense, don't walk out, just ask. And I'll try to explain some of the principles that we're working on. So a little bit about myself. Did my graduate work at Harvard University. Then I went on and trained at the Reagan Institute in Belgium, which is the leading institute in terms of antiviral drug discovery. 90% of all the approved antivirals have been developed at the Reagan Institute. Did a little bit of venture work at the Joslin Diabetes Center, part of Harvard Medical School. But what I'm really excited about was the experience that I had in building a company called Novera Therapeutics. And I got that opportunity very early on because Melinda Gates wrote me a $100K check when I was a student for the work that I'd done in HIV. And that galvanized the beginning of Novera about 15 years ago. It was also a very difficult time financially. Just the markets had crashed, so no one was investing. I was probably the second company in the country to have received any capital investment. But over the next several years, raised over $39 million from various venture groups as well as high net worths, and developed the first treatment for hepatitis B that provides a cure over existing therapies. The Baraclude is a drug that's a $1 billion kind of drug, but has a cure rate of 0%. So it developed the first therapy that was acquired by Johnson & Johnson, cash transaction, one single drug asset, $600 million. And so the original investors made 60x. The later on guys made 12x. They didn't complain too much. And they wanted to invest in the next company that was going to work on. And I wanted to kind of do things differently. So there's opportunities to do lots of drug development. There's lots of technologies out there that can be brought to bear to solve some problems that are really winnable today. But what's missing is really the right vehicle and strategy to invest in some of these companies that VCs are typically not able to do, and we'll talk more about that. So if we can kind of go to the next slide. But before I go into that, we're all here for the F1 and the Grand Prix, and that's just the underlying theme. And one of my colleagues brought to my attention the fact that the F1, at least McLaren, has a relationship with biotech and biopharma. Strange bedfellows, right? You wouldn't imagine, what does a racing car have to do with drug development? I didn't know much about this until 2 days ago. But it turns out that the efficiency and the speed and the technologies that they use to assess that is something that Big Pharma is really assessing and integrating in their development. So Sanofi, the big pharma company from France, GSK, they have active relationships. The one with Sanofi was just announced, I think, 4 weeks ago. So it was a shock, but not so much, because big pharma companies are not suited to doing drug development or R&D. And the inefficiency of biotech and biopharma is well understood in the community. So big pharma companies are inherently slow, and there's no innovation there. So it was not a surprise in many ways. In fact, this report from Harvard Business Review a few years ago just distilled it. From 1980 to 2006, the amount of investment in drug development went from 2 billion to 43 billion, but the number of drugs approved was roughly the same. So there's a massive amount of investment made, but the return on investment in discovery has been very, very poor. Smaller startups, however, shows there's a nice report showing that there's 5 to 7 times more productivity in smaller companies, and startups even triple that of smaller companies. So if you move to the next slide, and I borrowed this from one of the life sciences funds, and credit to them, but you can see that overall on the x-axis we have the time, and you can see that every year more and more drugs are actually being developed by smaller companies, and the number of innovative drugs from small or big companies is roughly the same. So the innovation is really happening at smaller companies like the one that I founded, or that I'm going to talk about, and many others. And we all know this recently with the COVID pandemic. It's not Pfizer that really developed the vaccines, BioNTech, it's Moderna, and even the AstraZeneca one came from Oxford. So it's not big, large companies, it's smaller, very agile teams that are domain specialists. And that is the interesting thing that I want to talk about. And biotech and biopharma, despite all the challenges of big pharma, I mean, it's a very kind of stable, secure industry in many ways. There's a need for healthcare. It's a perennial need. It's not going to go away. But the key thing that many people don't understand is that biotech has beaten the S&P 500 over the last 2 decades. And the public markets, obviously, but also in the private sector as well. And if you do the comparison with IT or tech companies, biotech has outperformed that as well. The only difference, as this graph at the bottom shows, is that the value inflection happens a little later because the drug proof of concept takes an extra 2 years to get there. But ultimately, it all works in a very powerful way from an investment point of view, despite the limitations that I just quoted. So before we go further, and I think this is just a general knowledge aspect that I think everyone should appreciate. I'm always surprised that many people don't. So all of the diseases, from headaches to cancer to diabetes, they're all caused by a protein in your body. Either there's too much of it, too less of it, and ultimately every drug works by acting on it. That's just the principle of modern medicine. So in terms of scale, you can see cells are tiny, that from high school biology, but you cannot see a protein. They're so small, the only way to visualize them is by actually measuring the electron clouds on those, by working at some of these leading particle accelerators. One not too far from here, CERN, the Hadron Collider. And there's other synchrotrons that we use where we map the structure of proteins. And why is that important? That's important because a drug binds by hitting a protein pocket. Each protein has its own shape, and there are 800,000 proteins in humans. We have drugged only a couple hundred of them so far. So you can appreciate that the amount of the universe that we have not uncovered yet is massive. And the question will be why? And the reason is several reasons. Technology is there in large part, but the issue is the long development process, which provides multiple opportunities for investors to come in and out. And this is, if you kind of just look above, it starts from discovery. You develop your first molecule, you optimize it, then you take it through preclinical development, and you file an application with the FDA. And then this is what everyone knows about, the clinical trials. Phase 1, safety. Phase 2, efficacy. Phase 3, larger study. General public, general investor understands this and going to market. Percent royalties, how much is the drug worth, etc. But this is the ROI sweet spot that is unoccupied. So it's not only just the ROI aspect here, but the other element also is this is the stage gate for developing new drugs. Also called the valley of death in our industry, because there is no funding available other than federal funding. And there is no formal apparatus to take advantage of that. Typically you have academics who are not drug developers. And for that, if you can just go back to that slide again for a moment. The value inflection from here to here is incremental, it's exponential. And the difference here is that venture capitalists, even specialized VCs, they come in late stage development. At that stage, it's too late. You're essentially using the money to do a clinical trial and get a yes or no. It's a very binary outcome. And that's one of the reasons many of these funds, they don't have a nice kind of consistent result because of the binary nature of this. The real opportunity to do work is actually in the preclinical phase, the translation phase, which is where all the mistakes are made or the good decisions are made. And there's this general rush to move things into phase 1, phase 2, because that gets the public excited, that gets the investors excited, because psychologically you feel good that it works in humans in this phase, that phase. But that is part of the problem, and there's no funding available at the earlier stage, which is where the maximum return on investment is. And that's what we need to go after to be able to open the 99.9% of the druggable proteome that has not been accessed. So how are we doing that? So we've built a very unique model, probably one that you'll not hear about again after today. Well, maybe you will in a good way, but you won't hear anyone else pitch this model. So we are a drug development company and a venture fund all at once. So we invest in companies that we incubate and start ourselves. We centrally manage them because you need, and everyone needs to understand the specialist aspect of drug development. You cannot make educated bets unless you are actually rolling your sleeves and doing those experiments. And the kind of information that we have and the knowledge that we have, we're actually working on some of these projects, enables us to make the right calls from a technical point of view. And so in this case, the company is named Pledge, obviously with a pledge to innovate and to expand the druggable universe and to develop new classes of medicines which are very significantly restricted. So if we go on to the next slide. So I just mentioned this, drug discovery and venture investment under one roof, and interestingly, a recent McKinsey report independently talked about the need to do the same, because these large companies are not efficient, but also the traditional model that we're looking to innovate is a single asset model. You have one technology, one idea, you go to a venture capitalist, and then you launch a company, and that's it. But what's missing is the opportunity to look at it strategically, take abstract positions on the unmet need, talking to pharma, and taking technologies or applying some of these technologies to develop some of these drugs that we can. So what we've done so far is we've raised 25 million, deployed that across 3 companies, and in the very short period that we've been active, we've been able to drug 8 undruggable targets that the industry thought was not possible to develop drugs against. Yep, move forward. So roughly, 25 million deployed, 3 investments that are managed by ourselves. We have multiple drug products that are in preclinical stage, 5 of them, and over $1 billion in terms of value unlocked. However, the most exciting thing from an investment point is we have a majority control in this, and we have very attractive valuations on these companies. The fund that we're looking to raise is on the smaller side, 75 to 100 million, and with the objective of taking 2 of these companies, which have already matured, to an exit in the next 3 to 5 years. One is ready for an IPO in the next 2 years. I'll talk more about that in the next slides. And so I think, overall, there has been a record amount of investment in biotech with the COVID pandemic, but even before that. But as I mentioned, it's all going to late stage development. And there's a trickle of nice projects that are coming over there. What's not there is earlier investment, and that's what we are looking to do. So if we can keep moving to the question.
Just if anybody has any questions, by the way, I'm just stopping early. Feel free to put your hand up, because we do want to keep this, moving and some voices. But
yeah, sure.
I guess if anybody has any questions, guys, put your hand up. Feel free to ask him. He's the expert, as you can see. So, but if there's no questions, he will continue. I'll put in putting it out there.
Yeah, feel free to.
Oh, good, Ali.
I did have one, I'm sorry.
Yes.
What do you mean by experimental AI?
Yep, I'll tell you. So we'll talk about some of the technology platform. So AI is being talked about all over the place, so we'll talk more about that in our industry as well. So yes, so why do we do early stage? As I mentioned, over $1 trillion in terms of untapped potential with the existing technologies. And as mentioned, 90% drugs are not discovered, and we are in a unique position to do it. There's no venture group that does drug development or has the expertise in building programs from the ground up. And that enables us to do a whole bunch of unique things. Recently, an interesting company called Roivant, actually a 33-year-old hedge fund manager, He raised a significant amount of capital just to acquire licenses, to get them outside of pharma and do it more efficiently. Had no internal programs or platforms, but just because they pulled it out from some of these large pharma companies, they could accelerate the development. And the valuation on Revant is over 10 billion at the moment. So we're somewhat similar to that, but different. So what we have is, it's not only just that, but we have a new platform that is what we've used. And this platform has its genesis in my last company from 15 years ago called Bavera. So the technology in many ways has been validated. In fact, it's actually been augmented and improved. So there are three components to it, as I talked about. The business aspect. We have in-house discovery platform that enables us to develop new drugs. We launch and manage these companies, and we control and carry them through exit. And it all has to do with the atomic structures of the drugs and the proteins. And we bring to bear innovative technologies that are on the wayside, that are not used in typical drug development, that have to do with particle physics, that could really accelerate the understanding of how everything interacts at the atom level. At the end, that's what it's all about. And then starting with clinically relevant targets. So it's not someone's pet project, it's not an academic exercise. These are targets or proteins that the industry has accepted that they would be very valuable to target, but they've not been able to. So we've gone in and we've solved some of these problems for them. Now to your question, what is experimentally augmented? So AI, lots of people know about it, lots of people talk about it, has different utilizations. In our industry, there's very limited results with respect to AI in drug development because it's a multi-component, multifactorial decision-making process. Humans still reign superior. However, if you really kind of distill that down to the atom level, and you can collect billions of data points, like the McLaren guys, their cars, the 200 sensors are collecting 1 billion data points every day, and that's why GSK wanted to work with them. We're collecting tens of billions of data points in a single day, and then feeding that into machine learning, and then verifying the results of that iteratively over time, and then finally you still want to test that in an experimental model, which is a biological model. So our first element is the physics of the interaction. Protein is just a set of atoms. The drug is a set of atoms. They interact, they release heat or absorb it. It's called the thermodynamics and kinetics of interaction. I won't bore you with that, but essentially that measures how tightly a drug is bound, how long it's in the system, and what is the on and off rate. That means that dictates the efficacy of a drug. And it's not only just that. When you're finding new proteins and looking at their new structures, you need new chemistries also. The chemistry knowledge that we have is based on 50 years ancient medical research. And the knowledge that we have is just not able to develop drugs that would stick into these crevices of proteins. If you can't visualize the protein, you cannot develop chemistries that can hit it. And to access some of those and to have synthetically accessible drugs, you need the power of AI to be able to do all those single part reactions and tell you which has the highest probability of being synthetically produced. So, 3 companies. Orthogon is our antiviral company. We'll talk more about it. We've invested $15.5 million to it. This is the most mature of all of these companies. Confirmation X is an immune oncology company. I'll tell you more about that. We launched this in 2020 with an $8.5 million seed investment. And then just last year, we invested in a company and launched it called Ubiquin, which is, believe it or not, proteins have a life cycle as well. And there's a new family of proteins that was just recently discovered that regulates the life cycle of all other proteins. I told you 800,000 proteins. There are 100,000 proteins that determine the life and death of those 800,000 proteins. None of these proteins have been drugged. So you can imagine, at the end of the day, everything comes to these 100 proteins. So modulating these is very difficult. No one knows the structure of these. We've solved the structure of 4 of them, and the plan is to do more of that. Team, I already introduced myself, but I am in good company. So Mark Spivey spent a good chunk of his career at Eisai Pharmaceuticals, a Japanese multinational heading up their medicinal chemistry in the US, and spent all of his time advancing 23 candidates into the clinic, drug candidates. He's the inventor of 2 FDA-approved drugs. And then I recruited Stephen Weeks, a professor in Leuven in Belgium, the leader in structural biology and biophysics. In terms of some of the advisors that have that are on our board, so Dr. Chitalia, he's a professor at MIT, also a practicing physician, and I'll tell you why that's relevant, some of these clinical advisors. Anil Chandrekar is the full professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and is the head of the kidney and transplant department. And Kwong, CSO of Vertex. Can you just go back for a moment? But I want to let Matt talk about himself. Let's just skip that. But a couple other people involved are Professor Richard Whitley, on the board of Gilead, a company that you must have heard about, also the inventor of remdesivir, and he is on the advisory panel for the FDA for COVID-19 vaccine approvals. And Marie Lindner was a former venture capitalist in the Philly area, my first investor. She left there to head global strategy at Novartis in Oslo. And she's one of the big champions of what we're doing. And Matt, you can say a few words about yourself.
I'm not a scientist, so apologies, I'm actually a lawyer, but whatever goes on here is confidential. I'm an investment manager trained as a lawyer, and my role is simply to create the structure by which investors can invest with confidence that basically keeps Ali and his teams honest. We're going to raise a bucket of capital. That capital needs to be deployed. It needs to be, we will decide, myself and the two science advisors, where that capital goes, where the greatest needs are, ensuring that the management teams of each entity deliver a cogent business plan, budget, and that they stick to that. And my sole purpose in life is to eke out returns and ensure that the guys do what they say they're going to do. Ensure that we've got appropriate governance, third-party valuations, due diligence, all the boring stuff. But it's all the stuff that investors expect when they write us a check, hopefully.
Thanks, Matt. Matt is quite modest. He manages a few funds in his life from Singapore to London. But that's maybe a cocktail conversation. So as I mentioned already, a footprint in Belgium as well as the US. And internally, not only are we just investing, but we have end-to-end drug development capabilities. So any protein, give us any protein, and we can have a molecule for it that can be ready for preclinical development in a few years' time. So that is a vast kind of set of expertise that we've built in-house. Obviously, we liaise with leading contract research organizations across the globe. Outsourcing is a big component of modern drug discovery also, but all the innovative work is done in-house. And just a little bit of a snapshot from a market point of view. So those three companies that we have invested in, one is an antiviral, the other is an immuno-oncology company. And if you look at the top 10 selling drugs the past year, 9 of them are either antivirals or immuno-oncology drugs. So this has been, this report came in later, but we understood this before. Immuno-oncology and oncology is the largest market. 60% of all the top 10 drugs and the revenue is coming from that. And it's still underappreciated. There's a massive opportunity to unlock that. As I mentioned, only a couple hundred drugs have been known to man. So we want to push the frontier there. This is a tremendously large revenue generating stream for pharma already. So as I mentioned, 3 companies. I'll just quickly run through the 2 companies. Third one is too young. Maybe you can talk more about that offline. But Orthogon is our antiviral company, and Confirmation X is immuno-oncology. Just bear with me. I'm just going to kind of dart you with some science on these companies. Coletta, if you just move on. So what have we accomplished so far? So 25 million deployed. We're not going out and looking for new technologies or new companies. So the time to kind of return capital is shortened by that fact. These are going concerns that we have been incubating greatly. Orthogon has a phase 1B asset as well as an IND stage molecule. It is developing an antiviral for the most common virus in humans. 90% of all Western adults are infected with this virus and carry it till death. And most likely, all of us do. It's a virus that infects our kidneys. It's called BK virus. And if you're immune competent, you're healthy, you're fine. But if you are unfortunately on a wait list for a transplant, you're waiting for a kidney transplant, 50 to 60% of you will develop reactivation of this virus. And there's no treatment for it. It is fatal. And this is how I met one of the advisors many years ago. The story behind that is interesting as well. A clinician who lost his patient to suicide because she did not want to go back on dialysis. She waited 5 years to get a kidney. The moment she got a kidney, 2 weeks after that, this virus was reactivated, and it was destroying the kidneys. So she had to go back on dialysis. She did not want to. And the way I was drawn to this virus was when I was at my last company, Novera. I was giving a talk at MIT about hepatitis B, and this physician approached me and said, why not work on BK virus? Hepatitis B has drugs already. And I didn't really kind of consider that too significantly until I got an opportunity, an invitation at Biogen, another big pharma company in the US in Cambridge, that has no antiviral franchise, but their top selling drug is for multiple sclerosis. And that too suppresses the immune system. And that drug is linked to the activation of this virus. And the FDA placed a hold on this drug for several years, sending Biogen stock down, plummeting, and they were scrambling to find new ways to treat this virus that their drug was causing. And for me, it was serendipitous. In a 10-day period, I met this clinician who was talking about the same virus, and pharma was talking about it. Neither had a drug. And it was very clear that this was something that you could do, and you could solve this problem. So that's the genesis of Orthogon. Started this in 2017. Second company we started in 2020. And the plan is to take Orthogon public in the next 3 years. It's already has an exquisite antiviral, hits the virus, very potent, very safe, and we have built the first New England BK consortium of some of the leading transplant centers in the US, from Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, and MGH to do the first clinical trial. So this is Orthogon Therapeutics, and the first drug, as I mentioned, targets the kidneys. In addition, there are multiple other programs as well. It's just not a one asset company. There are other programs. Another virus called EBV causes cancer in transplant patients. And this is an asset that's already gone through phase 1 proof of concept. So in addition to that, we also have an antibiotic that's in early stages of development. And there's not been a single new antibiotic developed in the last 50 years. So every antibiotic that we're using is 50 plus years old. Penicillin is 100 years old. So there is nothing there because it's very difficult to develop targets or target some of these proteins because no one knows what they look like. And that's what our core capability is. That's why we brought this under the fund structure, because this is a gift that can keep giving. We can solve the other problems that are out there with this approach. And finally, when the pandemic started, we knew we're not going to be able to kind of develop the first cure, but we started with a pan-coronavirus treatment. And we just have a paper that we're just about to submit, but there are 11 other coronaviruses in the Far East that can bind and interact with human proteins. Some of them have higher affinity to human proteins. So it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when the next pandemic would take shape. And that's not surprising either, because this is the 7th coronavirus to infect humans in the last 2 decades. There's been 3 in the last 20 years that have caused epidemics: SARS-1, MERS, and SARS-2. But there's a couple of others as well that are less known, and they've caused infections in children. So this is something that we are looking at it from a long-term point of view. This is not something that will be solved today, but this is a very dangerous family of viruses that we need to be surveilling and developing prophylactic drugs for. So the plan is, what do we do from here? What is the funding for? The funding is to do the clinical trial for the BK virus drug and recruit a management team that will take it to the market in the sense of an IPO. So I've already mentioned the advisory board. All of the leading transplant center physicians and drug developers are on board. And this company is something that we're really excited about, because we have really kind of started from scratch and solved all the problems one by one here. Just an example of some of the returns. So the first one is mine. I just already recounted that experience. But in antivirals are very unique. Drug development happens very quickly. There's this kind of view that it takes a long time to develop drugs. Antivirals are unique. So in phase 1, the safety experiment in 25 patients When you're looking for safety, you can take the blood of the patient and do PCR and see if the virus has gone down or not. You can do the full trial later on, but that's the early proof of concept in the phase 1 that does not happen in cancer or Alzheimer's or others. That saves a lot of time and money, and the return investment is greatest. And if you look at all the deals, they're all before phase 2 enrollment. So this is rapid, and some of the valuations for single assets are $500 million to multiple billions. So this is only something that this industry can do. Obviously the solution to patients' problems is there, but the capitalistic aspect is also quite enticing. We keep moving. So this is a second company. And if you just kind of go to the next slide. So 2019 Nobel Prize was awarded for the discovery that the immune system not only is responsible for keeping infections at bay, but also taking care of cancer. Every day we develop cancer, and every day our immune system flags it and gets rid of it. This is something that was not known previously. And the difference between a healthy state and a cancer state is that the immune system is suppressed. Cancer figures out a way to suppress or trick the immune system, and it does so by expressing certain proteins, sort of fake IDs, so to call, and that is how it suppresses the immune system. And if you neutralize that ability, you can unleash the body's natural response, which is something that is sorely missing in oncology, where chemotherapy, everyone's heard of, is how drastic the effect of that is on a patient. So we are not the first ones to develop a drug here. Every pharma company is racing to develop drugs. A couple have already reached completion. And Jimmy Carter, the ex-US president, he developed stage 4 melanoma. It metastasized to his brain, and he was on one of these trials for one of these drugs, and he's completely tumor-free as of last count. Completely regressed using one of these immune oncology approaches. So the question is if that's the case, if everyone has a drug, what are you talking about? So, well, the problem is that there are two classes of drugs in the universe of drugs. One's an oral pill, like an aspirin. Another is an antibody or a protein, and this is not something that's orally bioavailable. This is an injection you take. And the problem with this is that if you develop severe side effects, you cannot do anything. It is in your system for 4 months. And there have been a number of fatalities because the mechanism of these has been linked to cardiotoxicity, heart toxicity. If you just stay on the previous slide. So what you need are small molecules, compounds they take orally, and they have better penetration. They can go and address brain cancer. These drugs cannot address brain cancer at the moment because there's a blood-brain barrier. Our body has a barrier that prevents large proteins from going in. So you need small molecules, and they have better tumor penetration, better clearance. If you have a side effect, you can let your physician know, and you can stop taking it. So you don't have to die unnecessarily. The other aspect of this is the penetration. The tumor environment is so thick that the penetration of large molecules into the center of the tumor environment is not ideal. So the diffusion and the permeation is only better with small molecules. And separately, easier to administer. It's easier to take a pill at home than to go into the clinic. And adherence is a really important component of this as well. Cost and manufacturing as well. Many of these large antibodies, actually all of them, need to store it in a -80 freezer. That's one of the COVID vaccine type of stories that some of you may have heard, where you cannot leave it outside, it goes bad. Whereas a pill you can stick in your fridge or leave it at ambient temperature. So there is no small molecule drug in this fascinating field, and we are the first ones to develop a portfolio of 8 different drugs for different cancers using this approach that I just talked about. Here's an example. So this is a tumor spheroid. These are tumor cells. They're free-floating, and they are treated with exceeding concentrations of a well-known drug, 5-FU, and you can see that tumor shrinkage is only modest after 7 days. We are just very early on in our process, and this is data that just came in 2 weeks ago, and I thought I'd share it because I was very excited with it. So here's our experiment, untreated tumor cell. This is lung cell tumor. And there are 3 different drugs that we were qualifying and validating, and you can see that over a 7-day period, they've each shrunk significantly. And this is something that the gold standard is not able to do in a model that is very aggressive. This is a biologically very relevant model. It goes to the point earlier, what do you mean experimentally augmented? When you can feed in the coordinates of the interaction of this drug to the protein, and this data is overlaid on it, the next iteration of the data that comes out becomes a lot more potent.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
What are the current known side effects of that process of that drug?
Are you talking about this drug?
Yes.
So it's an early drug. It's a hit discovery. So the side effects ultimately will be looked at. The only way in an early stage you look at it is by animals. So there's none in terms of safety. There's no toxicology at 1,000 times the dose that's required to achieve the biological effect. So it's safe. There's no toxicity, and for that you need phase 1 data, and that's where VCs typically like to come and invest. And the point I'm trying to make is that if you have models like the way we do, and you understand the translation of this, we can take earlier bets and come in here because we are sufficiently satisfied that this is safe enough for it to go into humans.
One more. Sorry to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but why aren't you bought up and stowed away somewhere so we don't ever hear about you? I hope I'm not stepping on anybody's toes, but you're basically telling me that the billion-dollar cancer industry is going to be ended with this amazing solution.
No, so let me just be clear. We're not going to solve every cancer. We don't understand every cancer. But as I said earlier, there are several winnable cancers that we can do something about, and that is what this is all about. So this is not looking for frontier technologies, areas that have not been covered. These are areas that we know about, pharma knows. They're unable to develop drugs. We are able to do that. But to say that all cancer is going to be cured with one drug is not possible scientifically. So every cancer has different kind of proteins that cause it, different genes, and that's the problem with clinical trials also. So the clinical trials, you need large populations because the same cancer that causes kidney cancer in Europeans versus Asians could be a totally different mechanism. So you need large statistically powered clinical trials to do that.
Thank you very, very much.
All right, but yes, you are right in terms of the oncology market. It's huge, and we just barely scratched surface. So look at some of these preclinical deals. Companies are acquired before phase 1 development. And that's really music to our ears, not from an investment point of view only, but just because that means we can do more of this quickly. Because when you start going into phase 1 and 2, you have regulatory issues. That takes time. There's lots of bureaucracy with the FDA and so on. But pharma is the biggest customer for us. So some of these deals, some big pharma companies from Astellas to BMS and AstraZeneca are acquiring these companies, single asset companies, for $500 million to several $1 billion. Gives you an idea of how attractive this area of research is, and none of them are small molecules. They're all those large proteins that I'm talking about. So this really is an exciting kind of component from a drug development point of view because you don't have to wait 7-8 years to reach maturity. We're looking at 5-year timelines from 0 to exit. And even during the pandemic, the buyout in the cancer world continued on. If you keep going further, pharma does not want you to go further because the valuation becomes higher and higher. But here's some examples. If you go to phase 1, phase 2, the multiples start kind of ticking further. So it gets more and more unattractive for pharma to buy. And that is where it's not. That's not where I would invest because the valuations of these companies are very high, and we don't have a really nice way of doing diligence on what these guys have done. Pharma does the best they can, but unless you've really been involved at the ground level and you can really validate every experiment yourself, you're not able to make that call. So that's all in terms of the science. And Matt, do you want to say a few things about the fund or something?
Yeah, sure. So that's heavy duty stuff, which I don't really understand. But what I'm really focused on is why would you want to invest in our fund, in our team, in our products? And there's a lot of different products you could potentially invest in at different ends of the private equity VC startup scale. So what we've tried to do is eliminate the things that I hear all the time people don't like about venture and private equity, and create a a product that is accessible, but which ultimately relies on the passion of this guy and his team in order to deliver the sort of returns that we think are possible. So what we've done is, if you look at a traditional fund, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, probably have invested in, stuff that I've been doing for 20 years, you are heavily reliant on the team, the GP team, the management team, to go and source deals, negotiate attractive terms, manage those assets, and sell them. We have a portfolio of assets that exist, that have been incubated, that are seeded, that are ready to go. So there's no risk that your investment won't be deployed. There's no risk that your cash sits on the sidelines and isn't put to work. To the extent you wanted to, you could have your own experts validate everything that Ali's saying. We are preparing, again, for the benefit of investors, a third-party diligence report that can be relied upon, that validates everything on the science side, but also the market opportunity, the market set, which is essentially where we're going to drive our returns from. So you know exactly what you're investing into. You can see the companies, you can talk to management, you can talk to this guy. It's a very different proposition to a more traditional venture private equity fund. The other thing I hear all the time about funds that I'm involved with is management fees are prohibitively expensive. So people are getting rich by managing funds based on just the size of the assets. So you raise a big fund, you make your 2% management fee, and that's enough to keep people happy, keep management happy, enrich management. We don't like that model. We don't think management should be enriched by fees that are just based on the size of the fund, that have nothing to do with performance. Yes, there's a carry element, we'll come on to carry, but nobody should be buying a Bentley based on just the size of the assets that they manage. So this fund has no management fee. So there's no fee. We're essentially working for nothing, and we're purely remunerated by performance. And on performance, we're not having a traditional carry model where we split the profits amongst ourselves as investors. Everybody working on this structure, myself included, will be alongside you, invested in each of these companies ourselves. I'll be invested in the same way that Ali will be invested. So there's complete, talk about alignment of interest with investors. There's complete alignment of interest because we're all going to be invested in the same stuff. So we all want to see a return. We all want to see our capital get back, and we want to talk about the sort of returns that Ali's mentioned. I think the third one is more of a qualitative thing. I deal a lot in private equity. Private equity companies and private equity funds make their money by just selling companies amongst themselves. There's slightly more leverage, slightly higher multiple, and that's how they exist. They just eke out returns by just trading assets amongst themselves. This is not that. So there is an element here of it's an ethical investment. If that's important to you, if it's important for you to tell your kids and your grandkids that you contributed some capital to a company that ends up solving some of the cancer issues that are riddling our society, and I think that's an investment worth making. And we're not asking for billions of dollars of capital. It's a relatively modest investment for somebody who is a high net worth person. But it is going to a good cause. It's not going to make some hedge fund manager buy him a beachfront house. We'll beat those returns. We'll beat that hedge fund manager's returns. But we're actually delivering a longer term benefit in the process. So again, we're really trying to differentiate ourselves from the types of funds that you'll all see, you will have been pitched 1,000 times over. I think that's really the selling point from an investment standpoint. Complete transparency, complete accountability, complete alignment of interest. You can't get much better than that.
Sorry, quick question. Because of the stage that you're looking to get investors in, if there isn't a sale, like once you go into the clinic, obviously the need for capital ratchets up. So if you don't make a sale to Big Pharma or to an external party, you're going to need much more capital, but you're skewing the fund towards early stage. So what do? You need to go and find co-investors, or because you've changed the structure of your fund if you're not through the stack?
Yeah, good question. I can take that in the context of these two companies that I talked about. So starting with the immuno-oncology company, all the transactions are in preclinical stage. So it's usually, it costs a lot of time and takes a lot of money to do a cancer trial for the reason I mentioned earlier. A larger patient population, different kind of genotypes and backgrounds and so on. And that is the reason why we decided to go after this particular family of proteins, because there's already a significant amount of pharma interest. They know these proteins because they've developed drugs already for these proteins that are suboptimal. There are other avenues in terms of oncology that we could equally have deployed. However, in that case, you can go into late-stage clinical development. So there was a strategic element in selecting some of these so that we can exit by the preclinical stage. And in certain cases, there may be a possibility where we co-develop with pharma into phase 1, and we carry a couple of molecules with them or license a few. But those are very good problems to have because in that case, you buy more of the credibility, and then you continue to kind of grow the company size and the pipeline. Those 8 assets that I talked about, I'd rather develop 18 of those because there's so much space in the immune oncology world, rather than take them all the way to the clinic. What pharma cannot do is develop 18 of those. They can easily take it into the clinic. So because of the competition, Novartis shut down its anti-infective unit completely. They don't do anti-infectives anymore since the last 2 years. 100% of their effort from that is going into immune oncology. All the big pharma companies are aligning into immune oncology. Gilead, big antiviral company, the CEO was on record just 3 weeks ago saying a bulk of their returns in 2030 are going to come from immune oncology. They're not going to be able to make these drugs by 2030. They are on a buying spree to acquire assets. And that is what we are doing in terms of building a very strong defensive portfolio that is going to be right for M&A in this case. So that's the plan. I'd rather go vertically rather than horizontally in terms of value building in this case. There's so much to do and so much value there. For the other company, if we're going to phase 1. That is the canonical endpoint in antivirals. I've experienced that before. That small trial that you need to do, yes, you can do a larger one, but there's a case study right now that's taught at Harvard Business School, and the drug for hepatitis C that cures hepatitis C, called Sovaldi, is really a case study. That same situation happened where Gilead was courting this company called Pharmasset. They had phase 1 data, and they were lowballing them and stressing the investors out. So $240 million was their last offer. They walked away. The investors really believed. They did fund the phase 2 trial, and then Gilead had to come in with an $11 billion cash offer to buy it off of them. And this is a message that's really kind of now not lost in big pharma in the antiviral space. So the transactions happen in phase 1B. That's the maximum value inflection point. After that, the value really does not increase that much. In this case, for Hep C, it did, because it's a very large market. In our case, it's the UK virus, and here the application of this drug is going to be 100% to all transplant patients. 2% of pregnant women, how many are there in the world today right now, 2% of them have this virus reactivated. Causes all sorts of comorbidities, but also mortality in terms of childbirth and so on. So all of these patients will prophylactically be put on this medication when they're immune suppressed. So the moment you're getting ready for a kidney transplant, you will need to take this drug for the duration of the transplant, 6 months, and then you can kind of be weaned off. So it's a very large market, and just last year, Roche recognized this, and they developed the first PCR-based test. This is the most common virus. There's no way to figure out who has it other than pulling out a kidney and doing, histology, just looking at a microscope. That's not possible. So since last year, it was just very possible that now you can kind of actually test who has it, and it is drastically underestimated. And now the essence is ubiquitous. Almost everyone has it.
Ali, so you have this truncated exit plan, but the fund is 10 plus 1 plus 1, I assume?
Yeah. But you're right. If it turned out that we need additional capital
and our investors were still supportive, then there's always the ability to introduce co-invest if need be. Now you've got issues around valuation, but those issues can be overcome. So you can do you could sell one part of one asset, or you could create a continuation vehicle for the ones that don't require capital. There's lots of different options for introducing additional funding if it's required at that point. If we tapped out of capital, which does happen.
Yeah.
Right, well, I think it's a good way to start the Friday. I was going to say, hold some Q&As to go and ask Ali personally. Guys, for the first part, I know that was a lot to absorb, but it was very informative.